Hey, so today we're going to talk about Division 1, Chapter 6 of Being and Time. We're actually just going to talk about one section, and that's Section 40. And but before we do that, I want to just go back very briefly to what we were talking about last time. When we were talking about Chapter 5 on Being In, where Heidegger showed you the dimensions of care as mood, understanding, and discourse. And I want to go back to that. And I want to go back to the very end of that chapter, just to pick up where we left off, but also to launch what we're going to do here. So I want to go to the very first sentence of section 38, which is on page 219. And he says, "Idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity characterize the way in which, in an everyday manner, Dasein is its there." Now you remember those words, idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. Those were kind of those were the ways that mood and understanding and discourse exist for the they self. When you're one of them. And so that's we looked at all those rich dimensions of our experience, but what do we like in our average everydayness? Well, the way we take those things up is as idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. So I just want to reflect on that for a minute. I imagine you think of yourself as an individual, a free individual. Probably you think you're doing something kind of important, going to school. I mean, I'm sure you are. Or whatever it is you're doing, holding down a job or whatever. People think they're involved in important things and so on, and people think, oh, I think for myself, I'm a free individual and so on. I want to look at a picture, just which I think is kind of a helpful image. This is Gustave Caillebott's painting Paris, A Rainy Day, which I'm sure you've seen because it's like one of those super famous pictures that gets made. Like you see this on a lot of handbags and things like that. It's just used all over the place. Anyway, but think about these people. Here are people like that man in the foreground, like and his wife too. They probably feel pretty confident. Like they feel like, yeah, we're important people. We're doing what's right. Like he's going to be wealthy, judging by that. He's wealthy. He's married a proper woman, and she's married a proper husband. They have nice clothes, fancy, expensive clothes. And good thing they have that umbrella, because then they can keep their nice clothes looking good when they get in to see their opera or whatever the heck it is they're doing. And they're pretty pleased to be living in Paris, an important city where important things are done. And so as they walk down the street, they can probably feel, like I said, confident, pleased, and proud to be a part of this thing that all around them looks kind of important and so on. And so I picked this one because it seems kind of like modern life. But notice that all those people are sort of detached. They're not engaging with each other. They're all kind of separate individuals. In fact, let's just contrast that for a second with another painting. This is the first one was, I think, from 1870 or 1877, something like that. This is 1668. This is Jan Steen, a Dutch painter. This is an example of what they call genre painting, scenes of everyday life. And this one's called The Merry Family. And you look at the way these people are behaving. This would have been a good one to illustrate mood, discourse, and understanding, because you see a lot of mood and a lot of discourse there, right? And there's a certain understanding of how to live. But here, you see people bubbling over, and that's sort of how they think they should behave. And there's the parents, the grandparents, the children, and hence the grandchildren, I guess, maybe neighbors, but or maybe those are all just children. Maybe those people had a lot of children, but there's there's quite a crowd there, and they're all they don't look tidy. They're not keeping precise boundaries. Like the man's drunk and laughing, and they're playing music, all kinds of stuff. Like it's just it's exuberant overflow. So it's interesting to look at that and to contrast it then with the Caillebott painting, just to see already right off the bat, to see how differently these people are living. Sometimes you look at one thing and it looks straightforward. You compare it to something else, and by contrast, you suddenly notice things about it. And so like here, this version of modern life in this Kai Bot painting is very individualistic and kind of alienated, right? These people aren't hanging out with each other. Anyway, I don't particularly. I'm gonna maybe later talk more about that contrast, but that actually is not so much my point right now. I just wanted to talk about this Kai Bot painting because I think it just looks like our life. It looks like modern life. Like the way you'd really make it modern. It's too bad I don't know how to do tech effects on videos. Well, actually, maybe I wouldn't do this, but if you could put little smartphones in the hands of those people, then suddenly you'd think, oh yeah, that's 2020. If you think of what it's like when you're out, for almost everybody, your interaction is through that machine, that hand-held computer, not with the person 6 or 8 feet away from you. So again, if we go back to that issue of lived space that we were talking about last time, and what's close and what's far, when you have that cell phone, your buddy who's maybe even in another country is really close to you, and your interaction with that person is charged up, and it's what's alive to you as you're walking down the street. Whereas the person who's 6 feet away from you, like in this picture, the man whom they're about to pass on the street, like, is kind of infinitely far away. So that's the point about proximity and distance in lived space. We can make that same kind of point about the people around you too, and you can think about where your human community is, and how much in our modern world, in our contemporary world, we don't tend to experience an awful lot of community with the people who are mathematically close to us, right? Anyway, but anyway, those points are interesting in their own right, and I will come back to them at some point, I think. Possibly not for a couple of weeks, or a couple of lectures, but I will come back to them. But here, I really, ignoring the contrast, I just wanted you to look at this picture and think of it as kind of a picture of modern life. So you might think, yeah, I'm doing something important, I'm wealthy, I got a good job, I got a good marriage, whatever. So I want to relate that back to this remark: idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity characterize the way in which, in an everyday manner, Dasein is it's there. I guess what I'm thinking about there is that man is a man of his world, and so I'm going to say, you are too. Generally speaking, we all are. And so we think of ourselves as individuals. We're proud of our accomplishments. We're proud of our thoughts. But I think as a rule, we're more like those driverless cars that people are trying to make, right? We think we're driving ourselves, but really, we're more like the ventriloquist dummy. Our mouth is moving, but it's somebody else's voice that's coming out. That man's opinions or your opinion. I mean, unless you're the one exception. Maybe you're the one exception, but everybody else's opinion is an opinion they got from the newspaper, like the one we saw when we looked at that Toulouse-Lautrec painting. You get your opinion from the newspaper or from the TV shows that you watch, or something like that. Like I am. Sometimes I watch TV shows, but often I have to turn them off because I get too irritated by them. For this particular reason, like, you watch a TV show and it's about, well, let's say it's some kind of romantic thing about a couple, and Billy has been cheating on Marianne, and Marianne finds out, and so she responds, and the way she responds, it's a certain scripted kind of thing, and it's the worst thing that's ever happened to her, and she has to get angry, and she cuts him off when he tries to speak and whatever. Like, there's a thing and you can watch show after show, and they're going to portray that scene the same way. And then the funny thing is, if you look at how you or your friends behave in that situation, when you find out that your boyfriend or your girlfriend, let's say, got involved with somebody else and didn't tell you, you confront that person and you play out that script that you learned from TV, right? I talked about how my son, learned the articulation of the world through what we presented him with as parents. Well, it's that same kind of thing. You learn how to feel and understand and speak through those TV shows, and we take over those stylized, stereotypic, and not very good ways of interacting that are written into all those TV scripts. We make those the scripts of our own lives. We hear pop songs that are very moving, and we interpret our experiences in light of the lyrics of pop songs. Or going back to TV, if you watch cop shows or anything like that involves tough guys, cool guys, fighting crime or whatever, being tough. Those ones also, a different thing in those ones irritates me. Whenever one of those guys gets asked a question, a direct question, the cool guy will never give a direct answer to a direct question. What you're supposed to do if you're cool, according to TV, not according to me, but according to TV, is when you're asked a direct question, you say something witty, or you answer a different question than the one that's asked, or instead of answering it, you say something that's like one step removed from the answer. But there are all these ways where cool, or whatever the proper word is portrayed as pointedly not participating in the straightforward demands of meaningful, responsible, civil discourse, especially like not answering questions. And sure enough, that's what people do, and imagine that in so doing, they're doing an extra good job at communicating rather than a really shitty one. So my point is, I want to talk about those things about TV. Like, you may or may not think those things apply to you. And others might have that view about you too. They might not have the same view that you do. But my point is, for most of us, most of the time, we live out of familiar, received ways of doing things, which means understanding like what relationships are, understanding how you're supposed to respond to the things that happen in them. Understanding what to say on what occasion and so on. And that's what I mean when I say somebody else is driving the car. Like, we don't find ourselves, as a rule, confronted in those situations really with the need for us to think for ourselves or to articulate for ourselves. We just find, it's like the ready tools of the carpenter. We find the appropriate phrase or the appropriate response. Like, here's what you do in that situation. Like our relationship to language, which isn't just a relationship to word things, right? A relationship to language is our relationship to understanding and mood. It's our relationship to how reality is given and the intelligibility of it, right? So, but our relationship to language is that we rely upon it as an easy instrument for navigating our situations, as a rule, without owning up to the intrinsic demands of thinking for yourself and figuring out for yourself how you're going to express something. So in fact, that owning up word is good. It's going to come back in a little while. So in that sense, you could say you don't own your own speaking. You become a kind of receptacle at something that carries something else along. And the same with our thinking. Our thinking and our care, in the sense of what we're worked up about. Like, one day you're worked up about something that happened in a place you never heard of before. Maybe it's the Gaza Strip. Maybe you never heard of that until you heard about something that happened there. Maybe it's Beirut, which maybe you'd never heard of, or maybe you'd heard of those places. They're pretty famous, but maybe in the United States a couple of years ago it was a city called Ferguson, or there are places that suddenly come up in the news. You never heard of them before. You never thought about them before. But they come up in the news and you're told something important happened here. And they tell you what that important thing is, and you're outraged, just like everybody is outraged. And you get very worked up about it. And soon you have strong opinions about it, which are remarkably like the strong opinions your friends have. And they're remarkably like the opinions that are expressed in the newspapers. And, there are 6 opinions expressed in the newspaper, on TV news or whatever it is, and these 3 friends have this view, and these 2 friends have that view, and those people you don't like have this view. But everybody has one of those half dozen views that were offered, or maybe it's not even a half a dozen. Everybody has one of the 2 or 3 views that were offered, and you think, oh yeah, I really care about this. I really think about this for myself. This is what I really believe. And then after it stops getting reported a lot, 1 week later, you kind of forget about that place, right? And so your care is kind of not caring, right? Your what you're calling your care about these things is really, it's a little bit more like entertainment. It's a little bit more like watching TV. You let these things get you worked up in highly predictable ways where your response is scripted. You pick the script you want, and then it just disappears from your view. I mean, that's how the newspapers work. So maybe that's not true of you, but if you look around, I think you'll notice that's true of just about everybody else. And so, that's the kind of, that's the way, those are our moods, that's our way of understanding things. Thinking, so-called thinking for ourselves. That's a way of talking about things, right? That is all of that they speak. That's all us, being the ventriloquist dummy, letting prescripted things come flying out of our mouths, and when they come out, they fit easily. They follow a plan, the plan that's been made. We think, oh yeah, I'm saying and doing the right things. I'm fitting in. You get a check mark, and then so you feel quite comfortable about it. Right? I'm emphasizing that word comfortable because that's the theme we've been picking up on with lived space and familiarity and being at home in general. So when you're that guy in the Kai Bot painting, confidently walking down the street with your views about politics and your satisfaction with your life pursuits and all those sorts of things. I said, I've got the right kind of wife, I've got the right kind of job, I've got lots of money, I have good clothes, all those sorts of things. And I think this about that, and I think that about that, I think that about that. That man may feel quite, I'm picking the man because he's kind of the star of that painting. He may feel confident and really proud of himself. Like he might think, I'm a successful individual, I'm really a self-made man, or I really think for myself, I've cut my figure in the world. Whereas, in fact, what I'm saying here is it seems quite the opposite. It seems like a thing that was punched out by a machine, And so, rather than that being an example of whenever we do these things, we think we're free individuals, we're choosing for ourselves, but rather than our everyday experience being an example of us really owning up to our freedom, Heidegger says something quite different. Heidegger says on 229. So this is now from section 40 in chapter 6. He says, Dasein's absorption in the they and its absorption in the world of its concern make manifest something like a fleeing of Dasein in the face of itself. And that's how what he says you should notice about those things we've just been talking about. Those situations where we feel like we're actually doing something positive and getting wrapped up in these worthwhile pursuits and so on. He says, generally, on the contrary, you should think of that as something, in a sense, more negative, as fleeing from something. What are you fleeing from? I mean, really, you're fleeing from freedom. You're fleeing from freedom and the responsibilities, literally, of being your own person. That's what he's going to call authenticity, or that's what we're going to translate Eigentlichkeit. It means really, basically, being your own person. And that's almost none of us do that. Like that's what we don't do. We don't want to be our own person. We flee from the weight of being our own person because it's so much, because that's challenging. And on the other hand, it's so much easier just to be one of them. That's what we're going to go on to talk about. Being your own person is our next topic. I want to talk about a thing that comes in between there, and I want to talk about our last chapter was on mood, understanding, and discourse. I want to talk about a particular mood because Heidegger does. That's what section 40 is about. It's about the mood of anxiety. Section 40. So he says in section 40, the basic state of mind. Again, that's that translation of Befindlichkeit. It's not a great one, but that basic. Let's call it Stimmung, mood, right? That basic mood of anxiety as a distinctive way in which Dasein is disclosed. He's going to analyze a particular mood here, and it's a significant one. It's the feeling of anxiety. So I want you to think about that. And his description of it is basically pages 231 and 232. That's all I want to talk about here, 231 and 232. But I want you just to think about anxiety. I remember once somebody who's very close to me, my sister actually, had been involved with this guy for years, and at a certain point they broke up, and it really seemed like she thought she had her life going a certain way, and after they broke up, it seemed like she just it seemed like she felt just disconnected from the world. It's like there's no reason to do anything. She had basically, her world had collapsed. The world, in that technical sense that we've been using it with Heidegger, that whole thing that she depended upon had sort of fallen away, and she suddenly found herself faced with the need to think, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to live? Right? And so she was sort of thrown back on her own freedom. And initially that was kind of immobilizing. Other times too, you can be confronted, maybe just in sort of everyday situations. Maybe you're confronted in a social situation with having to go out and go to a party or meet new people, and again, you might feel kind of immobilized in an interesting way. Like you maybe you very well know that people will be nice. You're not actually afraid of those people, or anything like that. But when you think of yourself as having to go there and be part of that thing, you might suddenly feel kind of immobilized. And you might even be looking forward to it. It's the opposite of fear. You might think, I'd really like to go and be part of that party. That would be great. It's what I really want. And yet you may feel a crippling kind of anxiety, and that anxiety might have other consequences. Like you might, once you know that thing is coming up, you might not be able to get yourself to focus on your schoolwork. You might not be able to get your focus on eating. Like when you try, you can't. Of course, the book is still there. You still know how to read words. You still know how to write with the pen, but you can't get into the appropriate, frame of mind, or we could say state of mind. That translation, you can't get in the right state of mind to be able to get absorbed in that text and work your way through writing the assignment or whatever you had to do, because you can't let go of this mood. I want just to conjure up a couple of those things, the story of my sister or the story of going to a party or something, just to get you to try thinking about what anxiety might be like. And so Heidegger says, anxiety is not fear. You can be afraid of, or it's not fear of something. You can be afraid of a car that's coming down the street and think it might hit me. You can be afraid of getting sick from the new coronavirus or whatever. There are lots of things you can be afraid of. But when you're afraid of something, it is something in your world that's posing a certain kind of threat to you, and it's a sort of a practical situation. So it's not there yet. So you maybe can't directly address it, but it's a worldly situation. You're going to engage with that thing, and you are going to be damaged in some worldly way, and you want to resist that, right? And anxiety he says, is a different thing. Anxiety is not when you're not confronted by any worldly thing. It's rather when the whole reality of being in the world has become a problem. Precisely what my sister's case is a good example of this. Precisely what is no longer available to you is that sense that you belong in a world and you can do the things there. And that's why I said, in that case of the anxiety about the party, you can't sit and work on that text anymore, right? The assignment, we're supposed to read a book and write something about it or whatever it is. You can't get into that anymore because you've lost your ability to just feel yourself an easy participant in the comfortable world. I'm going to read a few passages and then come back and talk about that. So he says, so on the top of 231, he says, that in the face of which one has anxiety is not an entity within the world. Right, that's the thing I was just saying. And he says even more. This, I think, really captures. So he's trying to give a phenomenological description, what it's like to live through this kind of experience. And I think this next thing he says is particularly good. That in the face of which one is anxious is completely indefinite. That's really what marks off, I think, the experience of anxiety from the experience of fear. When you're afraid of something. When you're anxious, you have this sense of anxious, but you can't say what it's about. You can't exactly say the thing it attaches to. It's coming from the thing. It's the situation as a whole. It's this indefinite challenge. And he says, so he says that in the face of which one is anxious is completely indefinite. Not only is this indefinite, he says factically undecided, like it's factically undecided which entity, like it doesn't come from a particular entity within the world. It also tells us that entities within the world are not relevant at all. Right? That's the other thing, right? Like it's not some particular thing that's challenging you, and so trying to do something in those worldly terms isn't going to fix it either. I mean, I guess an example I really like, I wrote about this in my most recent book, which is called Adult Life. I was writing about the experience of adulthood, and I was especially writing about a familiar phenomenon which people refer to as a midlife crisis. People often, deal with crippling anxiety, sometime when they're 45, 50, 55 years old. And like every day, like the world just seems, I shouldn't say the world, reality, let's say, seems just kind of too overwhelming in a way. But the world is still there. They still have a job. They still have money. But nothing that they could do in those worldly terms solves that problem. It's not about that. Sometimes people do try to immerse themselves in tasks, not to solve the problem, but to get the feeling off their mind. But in a way you can't. Like there's something in your very existence is bugging you, right? But he says, yeah. So what you're experiencing though is this indefinite source of malaise, and so it's not coming from something in the world, and no entity within the world is relevant for dealing with it. And so he says the rest of that paragraph. In other words, the world has the character of completely lacking significance. Right, the world which used to grip you doesn't matter anymore. The things that used to define mattering for you no longer matter. Right? We were talking about mattering is what that last chapter was about, right? And we're saying that whole system of how things matter to you has lost its footing. And then he says, a few sentences later, that in the face of which one has anxiety is characterized by the fact that what threatens is nowhere. Like it's real, but it's not coming from there or from there. Right? It's something that in a way permeates the whole situation. And he says, so then right beside where the marginal number 187 is, it says, so it's nothing and nowhere, right? Whatever it is that's challenging you. And he says, the obstinacy of the nothing and nowhere within the world means as a phenomenon that the world as such is that in the face of which one has anxiety. And so he says, so what? That's what's happening. Then he says on page 232, being anxious discloses primordially and directly the world as world. And then 10 more lines down in the middle of the next paragraph, that which anxiety is anxious about is being in the world itself. But let's pick that first one. Anxiety discloses the world as world, right? So normally you live in the world, and it is the inconspicuous framework and constant context and substance of all of your activities, right? And so it's precisely what you take for granted as just what is. So the world is what you're always engaged with, but you don't see it as such. You don't notice that it is the phenomenon of world. You're just wrapped up in it. But precisely what happens in anxiety is that world which used to absorb you, which used to be your whole reality, it used to be your there, in a way has lost its grip on you. And that lets you then see it and see, oh, I used to be living on those terms. I'm not living on those terms now. But you've now recognized that those were terms, right? That you were living from a certain worldview. You were living with certain values, like you cared about your marriage, you cared about your job, you cared about your children, whatever it is. Those things, your wife still exists, your job still exists, your children still exist, but they're no longer relevant in light of this malaise. So what has happened is your whole former structure of caring is what's being put on display to you, which is to say you are being put on display to you. So he says, so that's why he says, that which anxiety is anxious about is being in the world itself. So anxiety, so remember what the thing we've been talking about all along, my sort of opening theme is this idea of the problem we have when we try to interpret ourselves in terms of the world, right? But so now what does he say? He says, anxiety thus takes away from Dasein the possibility of understanding itself in terms of the world and the way things have been publicly interpreted, right? Anxiety actually challenges our usual way of thinking about ourselves and suddenly makes us unable to comfortably live with that sense of ourselves that we have otherwise lived with, that the whole world endorses and so on. So on the one hand, that is profoundly debilitating, right? This famous painting, I was going to show you this one. You've surely seen this a million times. It's Edvard Munch's painting, The Scream. This one is from 1893. He did a number of them. He started off with a pastel drawing. They did this painting. Then he did a woodcut. Then he did another painting. So, and this image, he made various versions of, but this is the most famous one. But it's actually called The Scream of Nature, this original title. But here, he's saying like this image. People generally associate this image with the very thing Heidegger is talking about, with anxiety. It's not like something in the world is wrong. Like it's not like there's an earthquake or a murder happening. It's just a normal day. People are walking across the bridge. It's the sunset and there's the water. But for this guy, it has become unbearable, right? So on the one hand, this anxiety can be an awful thing. But I want to quickly get to that point to say the next thing, which is why it might not be so awful. And that's what Heidegger says right after that. Anxiety individualizes Dasein for its own most being in the world. Right? That very experiencing we're just talking about is the experience of being driven out of the comfortable terms of your sort of worldly self-interpretation. What that means is the pressure is now falling on you to figure out for yourself what things mean and who you are, right? And so in that sense, it individualizes in the sense that it throws everything back on just you. And then he says at the beginning, in the next paragraph, he says, anxiety makes manifest in Dasein its being towards its own most potentiality for being. By I guess he means, what he means by that is that possibility that is available in any person, that is their most intimate possibility for being their own person, really. And he says, so anxiety makes manifest in Dasein its being towards its own most potentiality for being, that is, it's being free for the freedom of choosing itself and taking hold of itself. That's what I want to get to. What I wanted to do here is start from that idea, picking up from the last couple of sets of lectures, that we normally live as a kind of a they self, and just thinking through the ways in which the easy ways we tend to think of ourselves as free and self-responsible people who make choices on our own are ultimately not that convincing. They're mostly ways we are conforming to pre-established patterns that make all the decisions and think all the thoughts and feel all the feelings for us. And so what we call our own freedom, what we call our individuality, is really slotting ourselves into the machine. And I mean, I should say that same point could be made about the family scene in Jan Steen's painting, just as much as it can be made about the urban scene in Gustav Caillebott's painting. And as I said, I may talk about, well, I almost certainly will talk about that again in the future. But the point is, in either case, however you're living, like most of the time, we're living out of their script. And so I wanted to raise the possibility, which, as I said, is the pivotal thing in the whole movement and philosophy of existentialism, that we can be our own selves. But what we see then is that normal way of living is actually fleeing from taking responsibility for our own freedom. And so then the particular thing I wanted to focus on here was the experience of anxiety as a particular mood, which is the finding yourself in a situation where your world is losing its grip on you and you are being thrown back on your own freedom. That might, for many people, I think this situation, I'm recording this in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. I bet that's producing a lot of anxiety. I bet it's producing a lot of fear too, but I bet it's producing a lot of anxiety as people are sort of finding their familiar world falling apart. And so, yeah, you can be afraid about this or that. You don't want to get sick, et cetera, but also all of those things that were the sort of comfortable supports of your life and that you kind of relied on to make sense of how your life was meaningful and how it was going to be meaningful. All those things are kind of falling apart. And I imagine that's producing a lot of anxiety. And so I think these feelings of like, nothing around you is relevant, and so like you don't know how to act, you don't know what to do, nothing you can do is going to solve this problem, and you just live in this kind of sick feeling of like floating over the surface of things without being able to feel comfortable or good about anything. I imagine a lot of people feel that. It's not nice, but it existentially speaking, I mean, this actually could be a good thing. It may, who knows, maybe this will mean for some individual or for even a lot of people that they may change in a good way the relationship to their own freedom. Anyway, that's just a thought. But anyway, we will go on and talk about that in the next couple of installments. But that's section 40, and that's what I wanted you to be reading this time today.